Have you ever been in such a difficult situation that you thought the only thing to do is change my name and run? Well, our guest today on Rebranding Motherhood started to do that until she turned around, faced the past, and dedicated her entire life's work to helping others do the same. Today, we'll be sitting down with Jamie Norton, author of Making Peace and Beyond, who, in her wisdom, has developed curriculums to help others not only face their past, but to analyze it, to learn from it, to move on, and to do it all under God's grace and love and sovereignty and mercy, because Jamie can weave it all together. This episode will deal with the conviction we feel over our past sin and pragmatic ways to let the Lord into our lives so that we can live in the freedom that Christ died to give us. So sit with me today as we discuss with Jamie Norton on Rebranding Motherhood what it's like to allow God into the darkest parts of ourselves so that we can live in his light. I'm Jillian Timo. Let's get started. So, Jamie, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it, all the way up from Cleveland.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's much trouble it took to get me technologically equipped to do it.
Well, I appreciate you joining because it's new technology to all of us. And, well, there's no mistaking that accent. Jamie, you are very clearly not from Cleveland. So where are you from? Tell us a bit about what it was like growing up.
I grew up in a very different world, in a very different location. I grew up in eastern North Carolina in the middle of cotton, tobacco, and peanuts. And I was born in 1943, so I was born into a time when there were no screens. So the world was really very small, very safe feeling because we didn't have a lot of contact with the outside world, really. We had one movie theater and the movie played for 2 weeks. I was also born into segregation, which I never could understand because everything was separate. We had Help. If you ever saw The Help or read The Help, I grew up in The Help. I could identify all the characters. So my early world was very safe because my family was an old family. My father owned a hosiery mill that his father had built. I grew up on a street named after me, and my maiden name was Howard, and my grandfather built the church I grew up in, and it was Howard Memorial. And I had a cousin that it was such a central part of everything growing up because it was the only thing really there was to do because there wasn't much around. And so, the church was pretty much everything, but it was my church. And my name was Howard. Howard was on the door. My cousin thought the Lord's Prayer, when our Father who art in heaven, Howard is thy name. And so the earlier part of time was just very safe feeling for me as a child. We had a house at the beach. We had stuff, but it was a very mixed bag because my parents were both alcoholic. So we had two lives. We had the life we lived inside the house and the life we showed others outside the house. And so my parents were very actively involved in the church. They were very leaders in the church. And yet at home, there was always drunkenness. There was yelling, screaming, some abuse, some sexual abuse, pornography in the bathroom. I mean, it was very different. And so my first language was lie. We went out of the house and we had the right length of dress and the right gloves on and the right little hat from Miss D-Berry's. And we said, fine, thank you. And everybody said, fine, thank you. And we didn't talk about difficult stuff. And we avoided painful truths, never really solved problems that were difficult. We just avoided them. And we also talked about each other and not to each other. So you really never knew exactly how you were doing with anything, but you knew what people talked about other people about. It was a very interesting scenario. In some ways very safe, in some ways very performance oriented. And so it was a very interesting world. I had perfect attendance at Sunday school for 12 years. I was the good kid. I loved Jesus. I thought Jesus was everything. And I prayed and I made straight A's and I was a Girl Scout. We'd go see all the old people and eat cookies and drink milk and listen to their stories. And it was very interesting to be in that world in a way. But I thought that if I prayed hard enough and I was good enough, that God would fix my family. And so I prayed and prayed and prayed and did all these good things and nothing got better. Everything got worse. And in 7th grade, my sister got sick and the world changed very much. My parents were drinking heavily. My brother was young. And I felt totally overwhelmed. And I wrote a book of poetry that somebody should have said something. It was a lonely teenager teenagers committing suicide and little lonely ships on the sea. And just the lostness was so there. I found that book. And so it was kind of like a very, I thought, God, either you don't exist, you're impotent, or you just don't love me. But at any rate, you're not doing anything. I'm doing my part. You're not doing your part. I see people do that all the time. Wise God, did my part. I'm doing all this stuff. And he's just not doing what I want him to. But I got really, I thought I have to grow up. So I started smoking cigarettes, started drinking, started finding comfort in men, boys at the time, actually, but it was because my idea of what people wanted was sex from a woman, I became very promiscuous, and at 16 got pregnant and was immediately shipped away because we avoid painful truths and they couldn't avoid it, seeing it. So they had to send me off. So I went up to upstate New York and had into an unwed mother's home and was terrified. I think today, even when life gets a little scary, I'll go to the first night in that home, because it was absolutely terrifying. And, which is the other thing about dysfunctional homes. In your moment of most need, you either get abandoned or hurt worse. So I was by myself and I had a child that I was forced to give up for adoption, and I was told never to speak of it again. And it didn't happen. And I was to be sent to Seattle to live with some cousins that I'd met one time. And that was probably my father loved me. And I'll put that out there because my father and mother both loved me very much. I was very prized. I had many, many blessings, many, many benefits, but their understanding of life really shamed me for life because I was told, we're going to send you to Seattle and you're going to lie about why you're there because we want you to have a normal life. So my message was you can't exist, and have normal, you have to pretend. And so the lie in my life grew. And so my name was Mary James when I was growing up. People knew me by Mary James. Southern women always have a double name. And so I didn't like that. And so on the plane to Seattle, I thought, nobody knows me out there. I can be whoever I want to. And so I got on the plane in New York as Mary James. I got off the plane as Jamie. And for years, you could tell when somebody met me. So my cousins were wonderful and great, but you cannot get close to people when you can't be honest.
No.
I mean, and so I had these two lives going. And so I couldn't really allow people to get too close, except those people whose lives were like my broken life.
Right.
And so I kept finding people like me and started partying and drinking again. Finished high school, went to the University of Washington for my freshman year, and got pregnant again and had an abortion, which today I realize that even in telling my story, that was the last part of my story that I was willing to share, because I think it is so hard to really face the fact of having murdered your own child. And it was very difficult for me to put it out there. And thank God, and I always end that statement with thank God I have a savior, because that's the gift, is God forgives us. He knows us and he loves us, and that never changes. So, but that the shame base of me just continued to grow and came back this way after that not this way, to North Carolina after my freshman year of college and went to the University of South Carolina. My father still did not want me to come back to North Carolina at that point.
And how many years had it been at that point?
Three. And so came to University of South Carolina. I came home periodically. I would go to but he didn't want me to live there. And so I went to the University of South Carolina, had a real spiritual awakening. I was drinking and partying because that was what I did, and had a real spiritual awakening. I was driving drunk and I heard a voice say, turn around now or you're going to die. And it was very authoritative, and I didn't attribute it to God at the time because he and I weren't on speaking terms. So, but it was authoritative, and I did. So I cleaned up my behavior. Several months later, met a guy who was a big fraternity guy, and he did my drinking for me. And we had my daughter in college. I went to decorate the homecoming float the night she was born. I think it put me in labor, but it was and I graduated from college, and I was told, this is a woman thing. I was told to never beat a man, that
Never
you
beat
was
a
always
man.
a man win. I got out of college. I graduated from college, and he found out he had flunked a course that was going to keep him in another semester. Meanwhile, I had gone to work for vocational rehabilitation, and I was offered a full scholarship for my master's. I turned it down without ever telling him. You know, it was, that was kind of the nature of things. Um, so he finally graduated and we went to Minnesota. My son was born, and I tried really hard to be the good wife, to do everything right. I didn't realize how important it is to be a real person in a marriage,
Right.
but I really tried to perform without needs, feelings, limits. You know, everything was about him. And when our son was born, he left with my best friend. And I was in the recovery room and they were out with each other. And uh, I was devastated. And 3 weeks later, we moved to Atlanta. I didn't know he was out with her at the time, but we moved to Atlanta and he never moved with us. He kept coming and going, and it was very, very hectic few months. And I relapsed. I started drinking, moved back to North Carolina when this all came out. And I don't know, God has always had a weird thing in my life, because somehow when my daughter started first grade, I had a 4-year-old and a baby when we moved, and I was a terrible mother. I mean, I was hurt, I was lost, I was seeking. There were men, I was also, I did some things right, because one of the things you do is you do the really wrong things and then you do the really good things to make up for the really wrong
You gotta
things.
even that out.
And just so you balance it out so you can convince yourself that you're
Mm.
being a really good mother. So that was kind of a way of life. And so, and I loved my children, you know, it wasn't that. And they were better. They were cared for to an extent, but their lives were really chaotic. When my daughter started first grade, somehow I went back to graduate school and graduated with honors. So how, I don't know all about that. But anyway,
Graduated
about
with honors with a 7-year-old and
six,
a
yes.
6-year-old and a
Well, she was
3-year-old?
7 by then, and a 3-year-old, and about 1 semester into that, he stopped paying child support, and at that point in time, you really couldn't chase him down. I mean, it wasn't easy to force that to happen, and he kept moving, and I was gonna drop out of school, and my father said, "You know, I want you to be able to support the children before I die, and so I'm gonna pick up his child support payments while you are in college." So I was working for part-time and going to college and getting about 2 hours of sleep a night.
You were.
But but got a job in aging, which is really good because I now know how to do it. I was a training director, became the training director for the Division on Aging, and when the Older Americans Act was passed, and so I got to do some fun things there. They sent me all over the place to learn how to get old, which I now am, and it works. You know, it's like
You learned how to do it ahead of time.
I'm good at it, you know, but I was still lost. I was always really good scholastically and professionally, but I was a mess personally, and just really running as fast as I could. The Department of Human Resources in North Carolina asked me if I would go to a psychiatric hospital to be staff development director, one of the old asylums, you know, that were created in the late 1800s, and they were going to offer me a house to live on campus. So I thought that was great. I'll be close to the kids. I'll be able to go home when they need something. You know, everything will be good. And I don't know why I thought it was all right to move my kids onto the campus of a psychiatric hospital, but that's what we did. And life got really crazy. I met a psychiatrist who was absolutely nuts and drug addicted. And I thought, but he was the shrink of the shrinks. It was in the mid 70s and everybody was doing funny things. And we ended up getting married. We did a lot of marijuana and other drugs. And it was so crazy that we literally, I mean, to live on this campus, you had to be a PhD, MD, or department head. And we were making marijuana brownies for staff picnics.
Goodness.
I mean, it was a nutty time. I knew it was crazy. It was crazier than I was, but I didn't know what to do because I didn't think I could go back to church because 12 years perfect attendance at Sunday school did not teach me what Jesus came for. He knew I was going to need a savior, and you too, and me, and everybody. So I thought I had flunked Jesus, and I couldn't go to mental health because we were mental health. And
Oh my
so I
God.
didn't know what to do. And that's when God really reached in, and he I went to the pharmacy one day and somebody I had worked with who worked in community mental health. I had quit work trying to make this crazy marriage to the crazy shrink work. And she said, I got a perfect job for you. And I said, oh, what is it? And she said, alcoholism family counselor. And I think I laughed. And I said, I don't think I'm interested in that. And the job wouldn't go away. I mean, it waited for 4 months. It kept coming back. And finally, the world had gotten so crazy, I knew I had to go back to work. And they sent me to the first program in the country on alcohol and dysfunctional family counseling and for training. The first words were, every kid of an alcoholic knows what Christmas Eve is like. And they started talking about times in your life when you're the most needy, when you get hurt worse or abandoned. And I was like, okay. And then they said the second child is a female is likely to be a teenage pregnancy. And I'm like, everything just started coming out. And I thought, this is so important. It just makes so much sense. And I came back to North Carolina on fire. I mean, totally. I got myself cleaned up. I ended up running a 5-county substance abuse program. We had multiple services. I started the first program for youthful offenders in prison. I started the first program for after school program for the first student assistance program in the state and started the North Carolina Association for Children of Alcoholics. Started going all over the state and the country running my mouth. And then this treatment center asked me if I would do a weekend for family members of their patients. And that was the first Making Peace and Beyond, which put
That was
together.
the genesis. Because
That was the
it does sound like, at least at first in childhood, there was a really critical formula you had that went very wrong and it failed. And from there, it's easy for a child to ascertain that that's God's failure, because a child, their parents, their community, how that all functions, it's very foundational. And when there's a lot of love and then a lot of dysfunction, that's a fracture, right? And so when that fails, it's easy for us to think, okay, well, I failed, God failed, we both failed. But either way, there's deep failure that means I don't get my needs met. And when I don't get those needs met, that's incredibly painful for a child. I mean, you see that I have 5 children ages 7 to 1, and when they perceive, and sometimes they're good at differentiating needs from preferences, not always, but if there is a perceived unmet need, they will advocate, they will negotiate, they will lawyer, they will do those things. But a child who's truly broken of a pivotal and critical need will develop their own formulas to go at it again. And
there is
I wonder what you think about this. I've been trying to find an articulation for this, of a child who will keep developing formulas to get those deep needs met, and then those formulas, if they're outside of, or if they're just impacted by imperfect people, and those very pivotal formulas. I'm not saying anything superficial. I'm saying very, very deep needs. If formulas for getting those needs are continually fractured and just decimated, that is the beginning of internalized hopelessness, which will very often lead to a multitude of behaviors we ultimately need to recover from. And so it sounds like then when you got to this part of the mental health system that specifically addressed what was going on in your life, that you started to see formulas that were actually viable over a period of time to help people.
I don't think it was formulas. I think
Formulas, no.
I think that children who are in unsafe environments they create a self. They create a
Okay,
self
so it's identity.
accepted, a self that they believe would be applauded, a self that they believe would not be hurt. So that would protect themselves from the needs and limits and feelings that they really have. So it's basically a lie. What you learn is to live a survival fantasy of who you think you should be.
So
That
I'm
would
not even
help.
trying to get those met. I'm trying not to have those needs.
Yeah.
I must be disassociated from them in order to survive, because that's a pipe dream to get those met.
Yeah, I don't need anybody. And so, and you learn that language of survival, which means you learn to stand one step back and manipulate the world to applaud your performance.
Certainly.
The way you behave, the way you do is, and it's been called a lot of different things: the false self, imposter, the shadow self gets hidden. And the shadow self is the real kid, I mean, but it's really a disconnect. It's like you are sitting in 2 lives, and the wounded, hurt child cannot cannot bear to come out because it's dangerous out there.
So the real sacrifice isn't need, it's identity.
It's identity.
That's
And the
deeper.
identity, exactly, it's a lot deeper, and it's a shame-based because the child always thinks there's something wrong with me. If you saw that part of me, and it happened actually in the garden. As soon as we fell away, the first thing we did when we saw the creaturehood of us, the fact that we are these inadequate, helpless, vulnerable creatures. The word naked in the Bible, and Adam and Eve were naked. Everybody laughs at me because I say it funny, but
You do say it like a southerner.
But naked in the Bible means vulnerable, unable to defend yourself, and helpless. And so when we saw that that's who we were, we immediately felt shame and we immediately covered it up. And then we hid in fear with fig leaves because we were afraid of being seen. I've never met anybody that did not want to be loved, but almost everybody I meet is terrified to be known. And so there's the dilemma, because love is always based in truth. It's never based in our lies, never based in our creation. So love just bounces off of it because we won't let it in. And it's a weird thing. So that language of survival is what we live into, and then it doesn't work. So we keep trying to, it's insatiable. You cannot get enough. So I called it the more gene. We all have this more gene, so we get this. It's not quite doing it because we still feel empty because we're missing ourselves,
Right. And
And
so when
so
you
there's
started to develop these programs, you started to kind of you were getting to the core of something. And like you said, you kind of found what ultimately was the genesis of making peace and beyond.
right.
And that was in that weekend, that time away. There was something about time away.
There's something about information about the story that somebody could say your parents were alcoholic, and if your parents were alcoholic, this is what happened. If your parents were not able to love you well and give you the structure you needed, then these are the kinds of things that that will happen. It wasn't. Mental health. I've been in mental health for 5 years, and I had not heard any of this. Nothing was done in context. So when you look at the story that people were born into and you look at the behaviors that evolved, they all make sense.
Context is an important point because articulation of what you are going through, it's a precursor to being known. And so if
Exactly.
somebody can know what's really going on with you and then they have the guts to say it, which we'll get into, which was, you're very good at that, that can be transformative, truly.
Yes.
Because giving
it
permission to
is.
tell the truth in this space might be the first time that's occurred for someone.
I remember coming home from that program at training and thinking nobody will ever take my truth from me again.
That's how empowering it is.
And it was reckless. It was pretty reckless, which is I probably have a reputation for. But it was to me. It was like the key to so much of what we call mental illness. The key to so much of what happens in divorce and anger and conflict and every other part of our life. And so I knew what my life was for. And that was in 1978. And so it's been a while.
It's been ahead of your time. There's a line I'll never forget from your book, Secrets from the Third Pew, saying, it talked about the fine thank you facade can be seen in all of our mental health and prison systems, but it's a facade that prevents real self-examination. And I think sometimes too, what makes making peace and beyond so unique is it's not just an examination of the past, right? We can see how that can go terribly wrong in a therapeutic setting where it morphs into this aggrandizement that can keep people stuck. And so can you tell us a bit more about the development of making peace and beyond and how you started to marry the past with identity and drafting a future vision for the self?
It's like getting out of jail. It's fun. It was all, it was I now have hearing aids because I'm 82. And so I have hearing aids and my phone rings and then it rings in my ears and then I have to turn it off on my watch.
That's
But
the privilege of getting old.
I don't think I ever really intended to start making peace. It was just that I was lonely and I wanted people to know because I wanted company to talk about it with. But I started doing the weekends and then people started asking me to do the weekends. And then I went to the state office as youth treatment director. And so I was working with the State Baptist Convention on some stuff. they asked me to do some weekends for pastors because so many pastors grow up in crazy families. And the pulpit really determines the level of truth that's permissible in the church. So we went to a workshop. Anyway, all that happened. So I was invited to do weekends for pastors, and I did a 2-year series across North Carolina of weekends for pastors. And in the meantime, I ended up with a 5-day program. I left politics because that was way too, I became somebody I did not like. And anyway, I ran a 5-day program for a while.
Can I ask, what was politics demanding from you?
Lying.
Well, that's something you committed against.
Yeah, it was.
That's not going to
So
work.
I remember being called into my boss's office one time, and he said, "Your loyalty to the administration," because they wanted me to lie about something. And he said, "Your loyalty to the administration is being questioned." And I said, "There's no question there. I'm not loyal to the administration. I'm loyal to the kids you hired me to serve. Is that a problem?" Because I can pack my desk if you want to. I don't have to be here. And I'm not going to lie for you. I am not going to pretend this stuff. I've spent all these years getting that out of my life, and I'm not going to put it back in. And it was funny. He came 5 years later and said, that day was the day I realized I'd sold my soul to the church, to the sex. And he left actually before I did. but it was a real, it was a real interesting time because I saw the smoke and mirrors that go on in the political realm, and it wasn't me, and there's not compassion for children in that level. I mean, children can't vote and they have no money.
Right.
So at least that was my experience, and granted, that was a
Certainly.
long time ago. I'm not accusing anybody of anything.
We have to say that.
So because I thought, what do I love the most? And what I love the most in life, in my work, is watching the light come on in people's eyes. I love to watch people get hope. I love to watch people have the courage to change, to take steps in their life, to do the things that they are gifted to do, and just to have the courage to take that step out. I mean, that's such a privilege and a gift to be able to watch people live life up close, like, to be on a front row seat to seeing what God can do in lives. I can't change anybody. I'm a gray-haired old woman. I don't know anything, but I do know the guy who can, and I watch it happen so much that it's just, I mean, I know the fruit that can come out of being willing to face the truth of who you are and where you came from. It was funny. Making Peace started to grow, and I did it in like 10 different states. And then my daughter had grown up, and when she was 13, she was embarrassed to bring her friends home because she never knew what to expect. And so she and her husband had a church in New Jersey, and they asked me to come do it there. And I said, "Is there anything you don't want me to talk about? Because you know how I am." And they said, "You're such an example of what Christ can do in a life. We just want you to be yourself." And so we started doing them together. Then they moved to Cleveland. I never heard of Cleveland. I ain't going to Cleveland, but I am. So I never say never. God took me back to my hometown with the treatment center that he built on my grandfather's land. And I thought, God, I told you I go wherever you want me to go, but I am not going there. And I did. I still didn't like it there. The thing so I ended up here, and then we started doing a lot of weekends here, still doing them everywhere. Then some people that we were using a book for the follow-up group that was written by somebody else, and he fell away from Christ. And so I ended up having to write the book. I had just been lazy. And so I wrote a workbook called Making Peace and Beyond Breakthrough. And then some people said, "Jamie, you're getting pretty old, and this is really important stuff. We don't want it to die with you. So you need to put it on videos." And I thought, no, that's not going to work. I mean, it's active. It's not. And they said, "Well, it'd be better than nothing." So we started trying to figure out how the weekend could be fit with the workbook. And people were coming along because people just always showed up. I never thought anything would happen. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, we were going to just do the videos in the church studio. And then a guy who was our videographer at the church and a guy who was the head of that ministry came to the weekend, and they said, no, 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 we're going to do it right. So they put together a studio in this person's log cabin, and we had the clackers and the 3, 2, 1s, and we put together a mock weekend. And so the videos came out. Well, they did work. And so now it's going on in prisons, it's going on in halfway houses, in pregnancy centers, and college, and different states. And so I feel like my life has sort of went along without me, which is wonderful. I don't have to be there. And then some people came along, and they came and they thought, we've had a ministry that we want to volunteer for. They just happened to be, one was a videographer and one is a social media expert. And so they started doing that, and they put me on. I didn't even know what TikTok was. And I became a
You're
TikTok
viral,
person.
though. You did go
I am.
viral.
Yeah. We had one that went to 1.3 million.
Incredible.
I know. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And several, that were several 100,000. And I'm like, I can't even count that high. And it wasn't anything that was, particularly profound. I didn't think, it was like, so, but it's been a fascinating journey because I have really been aware that I'm just a thread that has been used for my peace. But for all these years, since 1978, God has brought people to put the thing together, to give scholarships, to keep it alive, to take it to this place and that place. And through the follow-up groups we have a new pastor, and he says, so much a part of the DNA of this church, I just want to keep it alive and keep it going. And so he wants a succession plan, because he said, how long do you want to do it? I said, well, maybe till I'm 85 or so. And he said, if I can. And he said, well, we got time to train some people. He said, how old are you anyway? I said, well, I'll be 83 in August. And he said, oh, I thought I had 10 years. But
Right.
so last week we had a thing for people who had been in leadership and involved for the past couple of years. And there were 50 some people that showed up. And it's just, there's a lot of life change that has happened through this ministry. And so people want to give it back. They want to pay it forward. And so I'm just very humbled and grateful and feel so privileged, to have it doing what it's doing. I'm in awe, and I'm curious about the whole thing. I don't have a clue. I've never felt like it was something that I would have expected. But I think that the thing that I wanted my life to say is there's a way back. I don't care where you've been or what you've done or what's been done to you. There is a way back. But there is always, God loves us and he longs for us. And it's not God that left our life. It's us that left him so often. And shame is Satan's greatest tool. And as long as we're walking in guilt and shame, my daughter and I did a class together not too long ago. It was really cool. And she was talking about how the marijuana smoke came out of the minivan and the funny sugar cubes in the ice box, and how Jonathan grew up in the Brady Bunch and she grew up in the Addams family. And the class was getting so anxious because they're looking at me, looking at her like, she's sitting here and you're talking about her, and and so I got up and I was just like, I'm Morticia, and I said, that's who we were, but it's not who we are, because Jesus went to a whole lot of trouble to take away our guilt and shame. And we are not going to dishonor that by holding on to it. We're walking in freedom. I said, but I will tell you something that I'm really pleased with. And that is that my daughter has the freedom to get up and tell her story without having to protect mine. I've given her the rights to her story. And so she gets to have her story. And now she's talking all over the world, but she's free to have the story that she has, because the biggest reason people don't get help is they're protecting someone else's story. They're protecting their parents. They're protecting their spouse. They're protecting their kids. And yet healing happens in truth. And it's a real double bind, because unless you can live in your truth somewhere, you don't have to announce it like I do all over the place. But unless you can have a safe place to be who you are and look into the eyes of acceptance and get rid of the shame and realize who you are and whose you are, then life cannot change. God cannot enter into a lie, and God is a source of healing, so that it just doesn't work. So I don't know. I think we have to trust truth. I've said, the greatest infidelity is to believe that the truth is bad, because the truth itself is always of God. Sometimes what the truth is about is difficult.
I think we can be easily threatened by truth and our insatiable need to protect ourselves. And speaking of those Making Peace weekends, I was at one time a recipient of one of those scholarships back.
I remember distinctly.
shall we say, I came rip roaring into adulthood, not doing a great job of organizing my life or figuring out what that should look like. And I had met this very nice young man who
That's a fact.
later attended his own Making Peace weekend and who is now running around with our 5 children while we have this conversation. And that nice young man had said, you know, there's this woman at my church that you should probably meet. I I had a lot to get organized about myself, and that required a deep dive into the past because there was always this, I think throughout my life, always this vision, this very grounded vision I had for myself in the future. I mean, I was that little girl playing with Barbie dolls like they were actual NICU patients from my mother's NICU. She would bring home all of the expired supplies, and I had that nursery running, and they were all American Girl dolls, but I was taking care of them. I knew I wanted to be a mother. I knew I wanted to be a wife. I knew I had a lot of different fun Barbie dream house career aspirations to go along with it. But for some reason, I just couldn't translate it into consistently organized steps. And
You
I think
didn't.
a lot of us are like that. It happens through a multitude of things. Some are fault, some not. All our responsibility to deal with our portion of things. And I think that, morbidities or not, everyone has to make peace with their past. I will say I had an advantage when I went to Making Peace, and this is probably usually how it works out. There was a range of people attending this weekend. And so I loved the advantage of starting on this process and examining the past, looking at myself in honest terms before we were engaged and married. And that was a gift that I received from that because it was not easy for me to be a real person in my relationship to begin with. And now I think year over year in marriage, I can say I feel more and more like myself. But I do think it started with that Making Peace weekend and then the associated class that went along with it for 12 weeks. We really reinforce that examination and start to look at what does it take to allow myself to be fully known as Christ knows me and loves me. Then how do I translate that into my family life, into my personal life, into my community? What does that look like for me? And I think it also planted a seed in our family that allowed us to be something I didn't give myself permission to do as a child, which was to be a creature of ongoing process and progress. That is so incredibly hard for us to give ourselves. And I look at this generation of kids who have grown up with social media now. Everything is so permanent and everything is so severe. You are so easily canceled. You are so easily unfollowed, cast aside. And, I think, gosh, if I was left out on a Saturday night, it was painful enough to hear girls talk about it on Monday morning, let alone having to watch that from the isolation of your dark bedroom on Saturday night where they're all posting photos and laughing and talking. I didn't have to deal with that.
Me
And
either.
it's very difficult. And so we look at this and we think Making Peace is more relevant. Making Peace and Beyond is even more relevant than ever as we do move into this age where social media is becoming highly algorithmic and people they're tuning in and out to certain parts of social media, many times due to what they're dealing with. And if you're going into, you can seek out a lot of things that can make you sicker on social media, and you can seek out a lot of things that make you, that help you heal and make you better. But more often than not, we will fall into what hurts us. And I think there's something about social media where we'll keep scratching at that. And so putting that content out there online, I think, is more necessary than ever to be a light to others. And who knew? Who knew that this was going to be a part of that legacy journey? Was
Shocked me.
translating what you've been seeing and doing since the 70s and saying it's not new. It's not new in every generation. There are things we have to deal with so we can know how to relate to each other, to ourselves, to our God. And you had written something in your book when you had signed it for me when I bought it years ago, when you had published it not long after I went to Making Peace. And you had written that your wish was that I would live in the love that Christ died to give me. And I think how difficult that
Yeah.
is, how potent it is to still hear that today.
You know, I think one of the things I want to be really clear about too is that a lot of times people think, I've closed that door. I don't want to go back. I don't want to look at this stuff. And it's like saying I grew up in Germany, I speak German, and I never want to speak German again. You are a product of your story. And so whether we know it or not, we're either reacting negatively or positively to what happened to us. And it's a part of the language we speak. But it's not about having bad parents. They had a story that they had, their parents had a story, their parents had a story. So it goes back and back and back. And we have a saying that it does not matter if St. Peter hits you with a car, you're still dead. It's like, I don't believe most people ever think they intentionally want to hurt their children. In fact, most people spend their life trying not to hurt their children, and that hurts them. And it's like, it's very, but it's not about being bad parents. It's about looking at parents are human. You are human. We are never going to be the finished product on this earth, and to really have compassion and to get to know each other, because we have to live together for eternity anyway. We might as well get to know each other. I don't know why we need to hide, but it's like being intimacy is intimacy. To reclaim the garden, to reclaim the nakedness. We are vulnerable. And somebody told me the other day, because I got a big job, and they said, I feel so inadequate. I said, I hope you always feel inadequate. Because if you ever start feeling inadequate, you're going to forget who's really running the show and how much you need God to help you. And you're going to think you can do it, and you're going to fail.
Absolutely.
And that's the thing that we have to always remember, is that we're vessels and we're part of a body of people, and we need community desperately to be able to function in our life. I mean, I tell people I do one thing fairly well. I don't do anything else well. It took us a half an hour to get on this podcast because I am technologically impaired. I had a leak the other day, and some people in the community that loves me and I love them came over and spent 5 hours drilling holes in my ceiling and fixing my plumbing, and then we went out to dinner. I mean, it's like we live to help each other and allow each other to use their gifts, and that's the incredible part of it, that, and I don't know that the kind of safety that I feel today is amazing. I know I'm loved. I know God loves me, and I know his body around me loves me. They're flawed and they don't do it the way I think they should sometimes, but they're there. And I think I want everybody to have it, and I love watching you. You're an example of why I do what I do. Because I remember that time you came to Making Peace, and I remember who you were and who God has helped you to become, and how I love watching you and Adam and the kids and all of the things that are going on with you. And I'm just so excited for you, and that you have the courage to step out and to do the things you need to do, and the healing that's happened around you is just, I mean, it's just really, what a privilege and an honor to walk that journey with you.
Well, you've been a big part of mentoring us this whole time, working behind the scenes with us for about 10 years now. So we appreciate you, Jamie. Thank you for coming on and talking with us today, for telling us about Making Peace and Beyond. And we will drop all of the links so that everyone knows where to find you, because as begrudgingly as you went into starting social media and your website, it's just beautiful. It's so well organized. It's a great place if you'd like to learn more about Making Peace and Beyond. There are weekends dedicated to this. There is online content where you can access the full body of Jamie's decades of experience working in not only clinical expertise, but in experiential faith. Thank you so much, Jamie, for joining us today.
Thank you, and love you dearly.
You too.
Bye-bye.
On Rebranding Motherhood, we talk about the lie that motherhood is a trap, and that if you are in a situation where you need support, then no one will be there to help you or to be a steady voice for you. I want to talk to you about our Project Loveline that decimates that lie and helps women get real help in real time. We connect women with resources, or if we can't find one, we become the resource. So if you, someone you know, needs to access our hotline, you can visit us at loveline.com. And if you want to volunteer, if you want to be that steady voice in someone's life, we would love to talk to you about your heart for helping mothers. Thank you.